When we examine the first key dynamic shaping this situation, we are not simply looking at a military decision. We are looking at a psychological and strategic trap that has been built over time, layer by layer. At first, involvement in a conflict often feels calculated, even controlled. There are clear objectives, defined enemies, and a belief, sometimes quiet, sometimes confident, that success is achievable. Resources are deployed, alliances are activated, and a narrative is constructed. This is necessary, this is justified, this will lead somewhere. But then something subtle begins to shift. The longer a nation remains involved, the more the mission evolves. Objectives become less precise. Timelines stretch. What was once a clear goal slowly transforms into something harder to define. And yet, despite this growing ambiguity, withdrawal becomes increasingly difficult. Why? Because the nature of the decision has changed. Leaving is no longer just about ending a military operation. It becomes a statement about strength, credibility, and reliability. It raises questions that echo far beyond the battlefield. What will allies think? What conclusions will rivals draw? What message does this send about future commitments? And this is where the trap tightens. A superpower does not operate in isolation. Every move is observed, interpreted, and often amplified. When it commits to a conflict, it is not only investing troops or resources, it is investing its reputation. That reputation becomes a kind of invisible currency, one that sustains alliances and deters adversaries. Now imagine trying to walk away from that investment. It is not like closing a failed business or ending a contract. It is more like stepping away from a promise made in front of the entire world. Even if the situation no longer makes sense strategically, the symbolic cost of leaving can feel even greater than the practical cost of staying. And so, the nation remains. Not necessarily because it is winning, not necessarily because the path forward is clear, but because leaving feels more dangerous than continuing. This is the essence of the commitment trap. We can understand this more clearly if we bring it down to a human level. Think about a time when you invested deeply in something, a career path, a relationship, a long-term goal. At the beginning, everything felt aligned. But over time, doubts appeared. The results didn't match the expectations. And yet, instead of stepping back, you pushed forward. Why? Because you had already invested so much. Time, energy, identity. Walking away would feel like admitting that all of it, every sacrifice, every decision, might not have led where you hoped. So you stay, hoping that somehow things will turn around. Hoping that the next step will justify everything that came before. Now scale that feeling up to the level of a nation. Years of involvement, lives lost, billions spent, global attention fixed on every move. The weight of that investment becomes almost unbearable to abandon. History offers us a powerful illustration of this dynamic. In Afghanistan, the United States remained engaged for 2 decades. Over time, the mission shifted from counterterrorism to nation building to stabilization. Each phase brought new challenges, new complexities, and new uncertainties. And yet, withdrawal was repeatedly delayed. Not because the path to victory was always clear, but because the cost of leaving, politically, strategically, symbolically, seemed too high. Leaders faced an impossible calculation: stay and endure ongoing costs, or leave and face immediate consequences. When the withdrawal finally occurred, the images and reactions that followed were not just about the end of a war, they were about perception. Allies questioned reliability. Adversaries analyzed weaknesses. The decision echoed far beyond the borders of Afghanistan. And this is precisely why similar situations become so difficult to resolve. Because every ongoing conflict is not just about the present, it is connected to the past and projected into the future. Decisions are no longer judged only by their outcomes, but by what they signal. Staying signals resolve, leaving signals restraint, or in the eyes of some, retreat. And in a world where perception often shapes reality, that signal carries immense weight. So, the nation finds itself in a position where every option carries risk. To stay is to accept continuous cost, uncertainty, and strain. To leave is to risk credibility, influence, and stability. There is no clean choice, no perfect exit, no moment where everything aligns. And that is what makes this trap so powerful. It is not built on a single mistake or decision. It is built on a series of rational choices that over time create an irrational situation. A situation where movement in any direction feels dangerous. And perhaps the most difficult part to accept is this: the trap does not feel like a trap while you are entering it. It feels like responsibility. It feels like necessity. It feels like the right thing to do. Until one day, you look around and realize that leaving may be just as costly as staying. When we move to the second dimension of this situation, the focus shifts from strategy to something far more immediate, far more personal, the cost. Because war, no matter how it is framed, no matter how it is justified, is never confined to maps or military briefings. It travels. It seeps into economies, into political systems, into the daily lives of ordinary people who may be thousands of miles away from the battlefield. At first, these costs are often distant, almost invisible. Budgets are approved in large numbers, billions, sometimes trillions, but to the average person, those figures feel abstract. They exist on paper, in speeches, in policy documents. Life goes on. But over time, the abstraction begins to fade. The cost becomes tangible. You begin to see it in rising prices at the grocery store, in the strain on public services, in the quiet anxiety of families trying to balance their monthly expenses. It shows up in conversations at dinner tables, in questions people start asking, where is the money going? Why does this continue? How long will this last? And these questions are not just economic, they are emotional. Because people measure priorities not only by what is said, but by what is funded. Imagine a community where schools are under-resourced, hospitals are overcrowded, infrastructure is aging. Now imagine hearing that billions are being directed toward a conflict overseas with no clear endpoint. Even if the reasons are complex, even if the strategy is justified, the emotional response is immediate and human. What about us? This is where the internal pressure begins to build. History shows us that no matter how powerful a nation is, it cannot sustain a prolonged conflict without the support, or at least the acceptance, of its people. And that support is not guaranteed. It must be maintained constantly in the face of uncertainty. During the Vietnam War, this tension became impossible to ignore. What began as a distant geopolitical effort gradually turned into a deeply personal issue for millions of Americans. Televised images brought the war into living rooms. Casualty numbers became part of daily news. Protests grew, not just in size, but in intensity. It wasn't only about strategy anymore, it was about trust. People began to question whether the sacrifices being made were leading anywhere meaningful. They questioned leadership, messaging, and the very purpose of the conflict. And once that trust began to erode, it became incredibly difficult to rebuild. Now consider the present. We live in a world that is even more connected, more immediate. Information moves faster. Reactions are stronger. Every decision is scrutinized in real time. There is no distance between the battlefield and the public consciousness. And so, the pressure builds faster. Economic strain combines with political division. Different groups interpret the same situation in completely different ways. Some see necessity, others see overreach. Some emphasize global responsibility, others demand domestic focus. This division is not just a political challenge, it is a structural one. Because a prolonged conflict requires consistency. It requires a level of unity, or at least stability, that becomes harder to maintain over time. Elections come and go. Leadership changes. Priorities shift. And with each shift, the direction of the conflict can become less clear. Now imagine trying to sustain a long-term strategy in that environment. It becomes like trying to steer a ship through a storm where the crew itself cannot agree on the destination. And while all of this unfolds, the financial cost continues to grow. Wars are expensive not only because of military operations, but because of everything that surrounds them. Logistics, support systems, reconstruction efforts, long-term care for veterans. These are not short-term expenses. They extend for years, sometimes decades. A study from Brown University once estimated that post-9/11 wars cost the United States over $8 trillion when accounting for long-term obligations. That number is difficult to even comprehend. But what matters more is what it represents. A massive allocation of national resources over an extended period of time. And every dollar spent in one place is a dollar not spent somewhere else. This is the trade-off that becomes increasingly visible. It is not just about what is being funded, but what is being delayed, reduced, or overlooked as a result. Infrastructure projects postponed. Social programs limited. Opportunities missed. And over time, these trade-offs accumulate into something larger, a sense of imbalance. People begin to feel that the burden is not evenly shared, that the priorities are not aligned with their realities. And when that feeling spreads, it doesn't just influence public opinion, it reshapes the political landscape. Leaders are forced to respond, to adjust, sometimes to reverse course. But in doing so, they may introduce new uncertainties into an already complex situation. And this creates a cycle. The longer the conflict continues, the greater the cost. The greater the cost, the stronger the public reaction. The stronger the reaction, the more unstable the strategy becomes. Until eventually, the challenge is no longer just external, it becomes internal. And at that point, the question is no longer simply how to manage the war. It becomes how to sustain the nation through it. When we reach the third dimension of this situation, we move beyond strategy and cost into something even more complex, the structure of global power itself. Because the United States is not just another country participating in a conflict. It occupies a unique position in the international system. Its decisions are not isolated events. They are signals that ripple across continents, affecting alliances, markets, and the balance of power. This is where the dilemma becomes truly difficult. If the United States chooses to escalate its involvement, it risks widening the conflict. What begins as a contained situation can expand, drawing in other nations, increasing tensions, and raising the possibility of unintended consequences. History has shown us that wars rarely stay within the boundaries originally imagined. They evolve, often unpredictably. But if the United States chooses to reduce its presence or withdraw, a different risk emerges. Power does not disappear, it shifts. When a dominant force steps back, others step forward. Regional powers, rival nations, non-state actors all begin to fill the space that is left behind. And they do so according to their own interests, their own strategies, their own visions of order. This is what creates the sense of a no easy exit. Because leaving is not simply about ending involvement. It is about what comes next. Imagine a neighborhood where one household has long acted as the stabilizing presence, resolving disputes, maintaining order, ensuring that conflicts do not escalate. Now imagine that household suddenly stepping away. The absence is immediately felt. Old tensions resurface, new dynamics emerge, and the overall sense of stability begins to weaken. On a global scale, the stakes are far higher. We have already seen glimpses of this dynamic. In regions where U.S. involvement has decreased, the resulting shifts have been significant. In parts of the Middle East, reduced presence created opportunities for other actors to expand their influence. Alliances were reconfigured. Conflicts took on new dimensions. The situation did not simply settle, it transformed. And transformation in geopolitics often comes with uncertainty. This places the United States in a deeply constrained position. To remain involved is to carry the burden of constant engagement, military, economic, and diplomatic. It requires sustained attention, resources, and risk management. It demands that the nation continue to act as a central pillar in maintaining a certain version of global order. But to step back is to accept that this order may change in ways that are difficult to control. And this is where the emotional weight of the dilemma becomes clear. Because at its core, this is not just about power, it is about responsibility. For decades, the United States has positioned itself and has been perceived by others as a guarantor of stability in many parts of the world. Allies depend on that role. They build their own security strategies around it. They make decisions based on the expectation that support will be there when needed. So, when the possibility of withdrawal arises, it is not just a strategic calculation, it is a question of trust. What happens to those alliances? What happens to those expectations? If a partner begins to doubt the reliability of that support, it may seek alternatives. It may strengthen its own military capabilities, pursue new alliances, or adopt more aggressive postures. In some cases, this can lead to greater instability, not less. And from the perspective of rival powers, the situation looks different, but no less significant. They observe closely, analyzing every move, every hesitation, every shift in policy. A reduction in involvement may be interpreted as an opportunity, a chance to expand influence, to reshape the regional or even global balance. This creates a kind of strategic tension that is always present, even when it is not visible on the surface. Every action carries a message. Every decision is interpreted. And so, the United States finds itself navigating a landscape where the consequences of its choices extend far beyond immediate outcomes. It is like standing at the center of a web. Any movement, no matter how small, sends vibrations through the entire structure. Some of those vibrations can be anticipated. Others cannot. This is why the idea of a clean, decisive exit is so difficult to realize. Because there is no single point at which the situation simply ends. Even if military involvement decreases, the political, economic, and strategic effects continue. Relationships must be managed. New dynamics must be understood. Emerging risks must be addressed. In other words, disengagement does not mean absence. It means transformation of involvement. And that transformation is not always easier to manage than direct engagement. So the dilemma remains. Stay and continue to bear the weight of global expectations, ongoing risks, and sustained costs. Step back and face a shifting landscape where influence may diminish and uncertainty may grow. There is no option without consequence, no path without trade-offs. And perhaps the most challenging part of all is this. The decision is not made once. It is made continuously in small adjustments, in changing policies, in responses to events that cannot always be predicted. Which means the question is never fully resolved. It evolves just like the world around it.